What's up, Starshines? I'm Sylvia-Moonbeam, and following the 500 subscriber special I made yesterday, I thought it'd be fun to do a deck tech video where I go over the contents of a deck and kind of the strategy behind them. I'll save my commander decks for last because I think I've covered those the most recently, and also just because they're the longest decks. For reference, all of my decks are standard. They are not modern. I don't have that kind of money. Also, all of these, in my case, are physical decks because I haven't jumped onto MTG Arena. I think it's a wonderful game, and I know plenty of people who play it. It's just not my thing. I like the person-to-person communication and spitting memes. So hopefully you'll see maybe a live card game eventually. But for now, just sit back, relax, and let's go over some cards. Welcome to my playmat. As you may have seen in the title for this video, this is an Oathbreaker deck. Oathbreaker may not be super popular, but I'm a big fan of the format. So, if you hadn't seen my video from yesterday, my Oathbreaker for this is Nissa, Steward of Elements, and my signature spell is Heroic Intervention. Heroic Intervention is a wonderful instant speed spell. Remember, for Oathbreaker, you can use any instant or sorcery as your signature spell. Being able to give permanence hexproof and indestructible at any time as long as you have your Oathbreaker Planeswalker out is a phenomenal ability. Even just using this once or twice can be enough to win the game. Nissa, Steward of Elements is one of the only Nissas I have that's not in a predominantly green deck. She is also the only Nissa that isn't mono green herself with an X cost. Her +2 allows her to scry 2, and as you'll see with some of the cards in this deck, being able to scry is one of our predominant abilities. Also, the highest converted mana cost on any of our cards is 6, so it should be fairly easy to activate this zero cost effect, because if that land or creature that we looked at is less than or equal to the number of loyalty counters on Nissa, you can put that card immediately onto the battlefield. As she is also our only X cost card, we don't have to worry about potentially losing a Hydra or anything. Her -6, we probably won't be using that much, but is still a good effect. You can untap to 2 target lands you control, and they both become 5/5 elemental creatures with flying and haste. They are still lands. This is actually kind of a bit of a weak ability. This is more if you need an extra swinger or two, plus the deck itself has some flyers and has abilities to make creatures bigger, so you really shouldn't need her -6. If anything, you'll be +2ing to get her even stronger and stronger and stronger, and if you don't need the defensive boost that the scrying gives, you can use her 0 effect to basically put a land or any creature from your deck immediately onto the field. You probably guessed from seeing Nissa herself, this is a Simic deck. It's blue-green. We're going to be using 7 islands, 11 forests, and 4 mixed lands. I in particular use Karn's Bastion, Hinterland Harbor, Thornwood Falls, and Temple of Mystery. However, if you want to use other dual lands, you are welcome to. These are just the ones I had available. Like I mentioned, Nissa is not the only Planeswalker in our deck. We also have Oko the Trickster and Kiora the Crashing Wave. Oko is a nice addition to this deck. It lets us put 2 1/1 counters on creatures we control. As I mentioned before, 1/1 counters are going to be a major theme of this deck. His 0 cost ability lets us, until the end of the turn, turn Oko into a copy of a target creature we control, and we prevent all damage that would be dealt to him this turn. Essentially, we can clone any creature in our deck and turn Oko into an invincible version of him. That's a fun effect. His -7 is until the end of the turn. Each creature you control has base power and toughness 10/10 and gains trample. Cure is kind of the balance to Oko. Her +1 ability allows us to, until my next turn, we can prevent all damage that would be dealt and be dealt to and dealt by a target permanent an opponent controls. Essentially, we give a opponent's creature some invincibility at the cost of them not being able to hurt us too. This is a really nice ability if you know your opponent is going to make a big swing with one of their beat sticks next turn. Her -1 ability is fairly simple. You draw a card and you can play an additional land this turn. It's a phenomenal ability. Love the ramp. And her -5 gives us an emblem. At the beginning of your end step, you put a 9/9 blue Kraken creature onto the battlefield. I have not gotten this effect to proc any time I have ever played this, but trust me, having a 9/9 each turn is phenomenal. As one might expect from, well, a green deck, there are a majority of creatures in this deck. I have them organized by converted mana cost, starting off with Llanowar Elves. If you have ever played a green deck, you basically know what this does. It taps to add a green mana. It's a fairly common card, but it is a good one. For 2 cost, we have Mara Leaf Pixie. Kind of a similar idea to Llanowar Elves. This is a flying 2/2 fairy, and you can tap her to get either 1 green mana or 1 blue mana. Also at 2 mana, we have Incantation Druid. Incantation Druid is actually a really cool card, and one of my favorite cards from the kind of the War of the Spark wave. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any type that a land you control could produce. In other words, this allows us to add either 1 blue, 1 green, or 1 colorless mana, obviously. If Incantation has a 1/1 counter on it, add 3 mana of that type instead. They have a secondary effect for 3 colorless and 2 green. We can do Adapt 3. If this creature has no 1/1 counters, it can put 3 1/1 counters on it. Next up is Wildborn Preserver. It's a rare, but I believe there are 2 or 3 copies in the Oko the Trickster deck, so it's a fairly easy card to get your hands on. It is a 2 cost, 2/2 Elf Archer with Flash and Reach, and whenever another non-human creature enters the battlefield under your control, you can pay X. When you do, put X 1/1 counters on Wildborn Preserver. We don't have a lot of humans. There's, I believe, only 2 or 3 human creatures in this deck, and the fact that if we have extra mana, which we will because it's a green deck, we can just stack on 1/1 counters, will make Wildborn Preserver a massive, massive threat after only just a couple creature drops, assuming we have enough extra mana. Setessan Champion is next, a 1/3 human warrior for 3 with Constellation. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, put a 1/1 counter on Setessan Champion and draw a card. Next up, we have Dryad of the Elysian Grove. It is a 2/4 nymph for 3. It also is an enchantment creature, which would proc, of course, the ability of Setessan Champion. Dryad of Elysian Grove allows us to play an additional land on each of our turns. If you have a lot of land, this will make him really good. Also, lands we control are every basic land type in addition to their other types. Next up is Evolution Sage, a 2/3 elf druid for 3. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we can proliferate. This will again give us more 1/1 counters, more loyalty counters, etc. Wonderful card, and it has a landfall effect. Next up is Nadir Kraken. Nadir Kraken is such a fun card, I just had to include it. It's a 2/3 Kraken for 3. Whenever we draw a card, and there is quite a bit of card draw in this deck, you can pay 1 colorless mana. If you do, put a 1/1 counter on Nadir Kraken and create a 1/1 tentacle creature token. Next up is an oldie but a goodie, Voral of the Hull Clade. This is a human merfolk, so unfortunately it does not proc the ability of our Wildborn Preserver, but he more than makes up for it with his effect. For 1 blue and 1 green, fairly easy for this deck to produce, and tapping Voral for each counter on a target artifact, creature, or land, put another of those counters on that permanent. Essentially, it just has a 2-cost proliferate that we can activate. It's a wonderful ability, especially considering we have a lot of 1/1 counters that we'll be dealing with. Speaking of which, we have Forgotten Ancient, a 0/3 elemental for 4. Whenever a player casts a spell, we may put a 1/1 counter on our Forgotten Ancient. At the beginning of our upkeep, we can also move any number of 1/1 counters from Forgotten Ancient onto another creature. Next up, I have Renata, Called to the Hunt. Now, I actually have both artworks of Renata, however, my standard artwork is in another deck. So I have the alt art here. She is a star 3 demigod for 4. And Renata's power is equal to our devotion to green. As you may have seen with all of our cards so far, all of our cards are predominantly green. However, we do have a couple cards that are just blue or share blue, which means we should be getting a lot of green devotion to make her more powerful. Also, each other creature we control enters the battlefield with an additional 1/1 counter on it. Next I have Battlefront Krushok. It is a 3/4 beast for 5 mana, and it can't be blocked by more than 1 creature. This is a wonderful ability if your opponent has a bunch of chump blockers. Each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it can't be blocked by more than 1 creature. Just having this card out immediately makes it so you can basically swing for game. Here we have one of the only humans in this deck. Rolesque Apex Hybrid is a 4/5 human mutant for 5 mana and an amazing card. With flying and trample, Rolesec alone would be a great card, but he has 2 additional abilities. When Rolesec enters the battlefield, we put 2 1/1 counters on another target creature you control, which is great. And when Rolesec dies, we proliferate, then proliferate again. This is utterly terrifying. Next is Tatiova Benthic Druid, a 3/3 merfolk druid for 5. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, aka a landfall effect, we can gain 1 life and draw a card. Next up is one of the only 3 artifacts in this deck, and this one happens to be an artifact creature. We have Verdurous Gearhulk, a 4/4 construct for 5 with trample. Everyone loves trample. When Verdurous Gearhulk enters the battlefield, we can distribute 4 1/1 counters among any number of target creatures we control. The last creature in this deck is Archetype of Imagination, a human wizard for 6 mana at a 3/2 power toughness. Not our strongest creature, but the fact that they are an enchantment will allow us to trigger Setessan Champion. However, the fact that they are a human means we won't get to proc Wildborn Preserver. Archetype of Imagination is a wonderful card because it gives all of our creatures flying. Again, this will make Nissa's ultimate fundamentally useless, but that's okay. It also prevents our opponents from having flying too. You may be noticing that we have specifically 1 cost, 2 cost, 3 cost, 4 cost, 5 cost, and 6 cost creatures. This is for a specific reason. We do not have a gap for a specific card, and that's going to be our first sorcery. That sorcery being Neoform. At 1 green and 1 blue, we sacrifice a creature to cast the spell. We can then search our library for a creature with the same converted mana cost equal to 1 plus the sacrificed creature's converted mana cost, and then put that card onto the battlefield with an additional 1/1 counter on it, and then shuffling our library. This is a really cool ability and definitely gives our deck some toolboxing, especially if we're looking for a specific card to win the game. Rampant Growth is a fairly standard card. It's been around for longer than I've been playing Magic. For 2 mana, we get to search our library for a basic land and put that card onto the battlefield tapped. Next up is Nissa's Triumph. Now, this card was actually recommended that I take out until I reminded the friend who was looking at this deck that my Oathbreaker is a Nissa. So in theory, I will always have a Nissa to be a target for Nissa's Triumph. We get to search our library for up to 2 basic forest cards. If you control a Nissa Planeswalker, which we should, we instead get to search our library for up to 3 land cards. They do not have to be basic. We can then reveal those cards and put them into our hand, then shuffle the library. If we have our Nissa out, this will allow us to get all 3 of our dual lands or Karn's Bastion. Next up, we have Quasi-Duplicate, a card that was somewhat added in as kind of a reference to Oko, since Oko can duplicate other cards. We get to create a token that's a copy of a target creature we control. This is a nice effect for 3 mana, but it also has the ability Jumpstart, which allows us to cast this card from our graveyard by discarding a card in addition to paying the cost. And our last sorcery is Biogenic Upgrade, a 6-cost sorcery. However, it allows us to distribute 3 1/1 counters among 1, 2, or 3 target creatures. Then we double the number of 1/1 counters on each of those creatures. Related to our sorceries, I'm also going to cover the 3 instants in this deck. All of our instants are 3-cost instants. I know as a blue deck, we should have more instants, but trust me, after doing some play testing, this actually works pretty good. We have Spell Snuff, which counters target spell, and if we have 5 or less life, gives us an extra card. We have Unwind, which again counters target non-creature spell, and we also get to untap our lands, giving us basically our mana back. And we have Beast Within. We get to destroy a target permanent, and its controller creates a 3/3 green beast creature token. Given the fact that this is a Simic deck, the fact that we have 8 enchantment spells, in addition to our enchantment creatures, of course, in this deck, it shouldn't be too much of a surprise. First up, we have Simic Ascendancy, and this is arguably the most important enchantment in the deck, and yet it only costs 2, 1 blue and 1 green. For a 3-cost effect, we can put a 1/1 counter on a target creature we control. Also, whenever 1 or more 1/1 counters are put onto a creature you control, you can put that many growth counters on Simic Ascendancy. At the beginning of your upkeep, if Simic Ascendancy has 20 or more growth counters on it, you win the game. Similar to Beast Within, we have a couple transmogrification spells. First up is Frogify, lets us enchant any creature that we desire for 2 mana, and it turns them into a 1/1 frog creature with No abilities. On a related note, we have Kasmina's Transmutation, another 2-cost aura, that'll enchant a creature, turning them into an ability-less 1/1. Despite the fact that there is a frog in the artwork, it does not turn creatures into frogs, but it's basically the same card, just without the frog. We also have Encrust, a wonderful card for only 3 mana. It lets us enchant an artifact or a creature, and the enchanted permanent doesn't untap during its controller's untap step, and its activated abilities can't be activated. This could be used to encrust your opponent's scariest creature, or it could also be used on an artifact to cripple it. Minor lie, I said there were no hydras in this deck. That's not completely true, because here we have a Hydra in the form of Hydra's Growth, a 3-cost aura that allows us to enchant a creature, and when it enters the battlefield, we put a 1/1 counter on the enchanted creature. While 3 mana may seem expensive for a single 1/1 counter, at the beginning of our upkeep we get to double the number of 1/1 counters on enchanted creature. Remember, this goes from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32 to 64, etc. If we have Simic Ascendancy out, while Hydra's Growth is in effect, we can rack up our counters fast. Next up is Sphinx's Tutelage, another 3-cost enchantment. Whenever we draw a card, and there is a fair bit of card draw, a target opponent puts the top 2 cards of his or her library into their graveyard, and if they're both non-land cards, sorry, it's hard to read this upside down. Whenever we draw a card, target opponent puts the top 2 cards of his or her library into their graveyard. If they're both non-land cards that share a color, we repeat the process. Next up is Bounty of the Luxa, a card that really should just be a land. At the beginning of our pre-combat main phase, aka main phase 1, remove all flood counters from Bounty of the Luxa. If no counters were removed, this way we can put a flood counter on Bounty of the Luxa and draw a card. Also, we get to add 1 colorless, 1 green, and 1 blue to our mana pool. This is kind of cool. At the cost of 4 mana, every other turn we get 3 free mana and a free card draw. While it'd be nicer if it was every turn, being able to have a free draw and 3 additional mana every other turn is really nice. I kind of wish this was just a land, like a special land that doesn't untap every turn, but it's nice. And of course we have Into the Wilds. At the beginning of our upkeep, we get to look at the top card of our library, and if it's a land, we can put it onto the battlefield. If we have cards like our Nymph out, we will get to play additional lands. This also kind of acts a little bit like a pseudo-scry, because if you don't get to play the land, at least you'll know what you draw next turn. We also have 2 artifacts. We have Gilded Lotus, which will, at the cost of 5 mana, allow us to tap it for 3 mana of any color each turn if we desire. And we have Firemind Vessel, a 4-cost enchantment that, while it comes in tapped, allows us to tap it each turn for 2 mana of different colors. They're nice. They're also not necessary, so worst case scenario, you can discard them. While I will admit that this isn't a perfect deck, it is a lot of fun. We have plenty of card draw, plenty of ways to lock our opponents down, and our creatures can get really big really fast. While this technically could have more viable options as a commander deck, Oathbreaker is a perfect format for this because it allows us to have our Nissa whenever we want her. If this was converted into a traditional 100 card commander deck, I would probably use Vorl as our commander, though to be fair, that's kind of been done ad nauseum. If you like this video, please leave a lunar laser like below, and give me a starshine, subscribe, and hit that Moonbeam bell if you want to see more content like this. Until next time, I've been Sylvia-Moonbeam. Stay cool, starshines. Peace.